Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are back again for John chapter 7, the first half of John chapter 7, I should say. 50 verses in this chapter. I'm going to cover the first 25 here, and this should be a short video. I know I've said that before and made myself a liar and gone like 45 minutes, but legitimately, I think this one should be short. Guess we'll find out. At 25 minutes, I'm just cutting myself off. But if you're new here, remember there are free notes and a free ebook down in the description below. That'll take you to all the places you need to go. And let's get into this. Chapter 6, we just concluded the conversation with Jesus and many Jews who were following him up in Capernaum, and the 5,000 had just been fed, and those people were interested in that physical bread that he was offering, and he was saying some hard things to them about him being the bread of life. And at the end of the chapter, a lot of people walked away from Jesus and didn't follow him anymore. Well, now we've skipped forward quite a bit, and we're going to talk about another feast and some events that occurred at this feast. So John chapter 7, let's just read verse 1. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. As we observed in our Matthew and Mark study, Jesus spent a great deal of time in Galilee, and John here tells us a little bit of the reason for that, because the Jews wanted to kill him, the Jews who were down south. Couple reasons for that. One primarily, and that was that he had healed a man on the Sabbath day. We already talked about that. Here in John's text, we have a little bit more information about the grudge that the southern Jews in Jerusalem held against Jesus for that miracle. That's not, at least it wasn't to me, as obvious as it is here in John's gospel, but they really kind of held on to this for a while. And also, no doubt, for his claims of equality with God. Okay, so verse 2. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. That's the whole verse. But there's kind of a lot in that verse, because the Feast of Booths is not one of those feasts that gets talked about a whole lot in the Bible, not like Passover or Pentecost or something like that. So what exactly was the Feast of Booths? Well, it's mentioned in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 33 and following. You can read those if you want to. And there's some other places where some of the details are talked about, but it was also known as, or could be called, the Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Tabernacles. It took place on the 15th day of the 7th month. That month's name was Tisri. And this would be around our September, October time. So Passover is in the spring, Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths is in September, October, fall time. The feast lasted for 7 days, and there were certain offerings that were supposed to be offered each one of those 7 days. And again, you can read all about that in the Old Testament. But the Israelites, the reason it was called the Feast of Booths, or tents, was because the Israelites were supposed to live in tents for 7 days during the feast. And it was intended to commemorate the time when their ancestors had lived in tents, when God had led them out of Egyptian slavery and they were sojourners in the wilderness. A really interesting fact we read about in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 17, it informs us that the Israelites neglected this feast from the time of Joshua to the time of Nehemiah. So probably about 1,000 years. The Israelites were not always as good as they should have been about keeping the commandments and the Old Testament law. There were times when the Old Testament law was almost completely lost in Israel's history and had to be recovered. And this was one of those things that kind of slipped through the cracks. And even, you think about it, from Joshua to Nehemiah, who's in there? I mean, all the judges are in there. Samuel, some of these good judges. You also have the kings, David and Solomon, and then you have some, not so good kings, but there was a few in between, at least for Judah, between the time of David and the time of being taken away into Babylonian captivity in 600 or so BC. And then Nehemiah is not until they returned from that captivity 70 years later. So there's a huge amount of time here that this feast is just neglected. And even some good men clearly didn't know or didn't keep the law as well as they should have. Well, I don't want to say that necessarily. They may have preached it, but the people were not accepting of it. We don't know which it was, but this was just a neglected command for a really, really long time. But here, this is after the time of Nehemiah, about 400, 500 years. Well, 500. We'll round it off. 500 years after Nehemiah. And wait. Okay, yes, 500. I'm trying to, dangerous to do my dates just off the cuff in my head. About 500 years after Nehemiah. And they're still keeping this feast after this apparent restoration in Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 3 through 5. So his brothers, Jesus' brothers, said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may also see the works that you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. We know that Jesus had half-brothers and sisters from verses like Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 and 56. In chapter 6, we talked about those people who listened to Jesus, but they didn't believe him. And in chapter 7, we find out that his own brothers, his own family were in that camp of unbelievers. Verse 5 says, "For not even his brothers believed in him." And if that verse wasn't there, verses 3 and 4, we might actually read those as Jesus' brothers encouraging him to further his ministry. They say to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." That doesn't sound necessarily negative, but verse 5 kind of helps us to understand maybe their intention behind saying that. It appears that those statements have a little bit of a hostile edge to them based on John's clarification in verse 5 that they didn't believe. They seem to have assumed that Jesus wanted popularity. They told Jesus to go up to the feast to make his presence known in Jerusalem. Say, no more miracles here in small town Judea. Go to Jerusalem where the entire Jewish world is gathering for the feast and prove yourself there. Kind of a challenge almost. If you are all that you claim to be, that shouldn't be a problem for you, right? So take your tricks. Stop fooling the uneducated Galilean people and go down to Jerusalem where there's the rabbis and there's the scholars, and we'll see if your words and works can hold up there. That seems to kind of be the intention behind them saying this. And just a quick application here, but Jesus had never sinned, right? So that means he would have never sinned against his family. He would have been kind and good to his family his entire life. And yet here we see his own brothers not even being able to believe in him or unwilling to believe in him and treating him poorly. We can't really expect any better treatment from our families than Jesus received from his own. Or at least is a possibility that we might be mistreated because obviously Jesus was mistreated. Verse 6 through 8. And Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going to this feast, for my time has not yet come." Jesus responded to his brothers by telling them that his time had not yet come. And he said something similar to his mother in John chapter 2 when she had that problem, or there was the problem at the wedding feast and they had run out of wine, and Jesus tells her that his hour had not yet come. Jesus had come to the earth for greater things than for seeking popularity. The popularity that his brothers thought that he wanted. He wasn't interested in chasing every big crowd to make a name for himself. That should have been clear. It was clear in John chapter 6 because he continued to say hard things until people walked away from him. So popularity wasn't necessarily what he was after, but it seems like his brothers suspect that. He had a mission, and it was working on a very precise timeline, and he would accomplish that mission in that exactly as he planned. Right? It wasn't going to be rushed. It wasn't going to be delayed. His hour had not yet come. It wasn't time yet, so he's not going up publicly to the feast. On the other hand, while Jesus was thinking about these spiritual things that he had to do. His brothers are thinking very carnally, very earthly. They think Jesus wants popularity. Why might they think that? Well, probably because if they were in his position with his influence, they would have been pursuing that, because most men do, right? That's where a carnally geared mind leads people of influence. Well, I want more influence. I want more popularity. And they couldn't see Jesus's higher purpose. Speaking of men who wanted influence and popularity, I mean, just look at the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, and what motivated them versus what motivates Jesus. But being carnally minded, kind of like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, his brothers can only assume that that's what he's after as well, and it wasn't. Understanding these differences may help us to understand what Jesus means when he says, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil." The designated time for Jesus' public entry into Jerusalem had not yet come. There would be a day for that. We've read about that in Matthew and Mark, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem the week before Jesus is killed. But this wasn't that day. It wasn't the time yet. The Jews hated Jesus, and they wanted to kill him because he had condemned their wickedness and their hardness of heart. And so Jesus couldn't just stroll on into Jerusalem, and make a public scene with this grand entrance, right? Because he wasn't trying to incite the Jews to the anger that was going to kill him yet. But that wasn't a problem for the brothers. He says that, what does he say there? My time has not yet come, right? I can't go in there and do that yet. That will happen only when I have designated it to happen. But your time is always here. The brothers were free to go in and out of Jerusalem as publicly or as privately as they pleased. They had nothing to fear from the Jews. Why? Because they shared the Jews' carnal mind. And they valued the same things that the Jews valued. There would always be a place and a time for people like that to find, I don't want to say it like that, but Jesus says, "My hour hasn't come, but your hour is always here." I've got work to do, but it's on a schedule because it's spiritual work. But if you're interested in physical things in the physical mind, there's always going to be people who are ready to accept you. I think that's what he's getting at. Jesus told them to go up to the feast. Jesus wasn't going up to the feast. At least he wasn't going up to the feast in the same public way that his brothers wanted him to go. And we'll see, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue on. Verse 9 through 11. After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" A lot of people get caught up on this verse because Jesus just told his brothers that he wasn't going to the feast. And in verse 10, it says that he did go up to the feast. And they're like, well, that's weird. And I think it's hard to understand unless you understand kind of the perspective that the brothers are coming from. They want him to go up publicly. And John specifically says that he didn't go up publicly. He went up privately. But initially, Jesus left his family, and they went down to Jerusalem, and he didn't go with them. Verse 11 tells us that there was a lot of people, a lot of Jews that were anticipating Jesus' family arriving in Jerusalem, probably hoping that Jesus would be with them. These feasts were large cultural events for the Jews, and families would have traveled from their homeland in groups to Jerusalem. Not completely dissimilar from what happens in, the United States when people travel in the fall or in the winter with their family all together and they go to some place for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, right? They travel back and forth together. That's pretty common. I think that's basically what we're looking at here. So when Jesus' family shows up, the other Jews are like, well, where's Jesus? Jesus had remained in Galilee 75 miles to the north, but then he privately comes down. We don't know if he walked or if he teleported. We're not told, because we know Jesus didn't have to move around the way that physical human beings had to move around. We learned that when Jesus was walking on the water and teleporting the ship to land. I don't want to use the word teleport because then it sounds like science fiction, but I think you know what I mean. I don't really have a better word for it. Miraculously transported. We'll go with that. All right, verses 12 through 13. And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, he is a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly about him. Just as today, people were still discussing the identity of Jesus. Who is he? Is he a good man? Some people thought so. Was he the Messiah? Some other people thought that he was not only a good man, but the Messiah. Some people thought that he was leading people astray, leading them away from the laws of Moses, and that he was a deceiver. You know, it's interesting when we look at the whole Bible and we think about these characters that are here in this scene. When you think about somebody like Judas or James, or we often refer to him as Jude and James, the Lord's brothers, who would go on eventually and write some of those epistles towards the end of the New Testament. When they walked into that city, they were probably among the people who were grumbling, about Jesus. They weren't believers. And yet, in just a few years, they would be going into the city of Jerusalem proclaiming Jesus to be the Son of God and the Savior of the world. That would have been an interesting transition. They had probably talked to people while Jesus was on earth, and they had told them that they didn't believe that he was anything. And then they would come back after his resurrection, and then they were telling people that, he was everything that he claimed to be and, and more, right? It also kind of got me thinking about, I'm glad that Jesus is patient with people. And I know that's been true in my life. And he's patient with his brothers here. He doesn't strike them down dead when they don't believe in him up in Galilee. And when they even say these things to him that are kind of like mocking him. But he lets them go, and he continues in his consistency in his actions and in his message. And eventually his brothers come around. And, I know there's a lot of people that that want judgment on the wicked now, but, it's nice that some of those wicked people turn around. I mean, look at the people that killed Jesus on the cross in Acts chapter 2, and when Peter's preaching to them, they, they're asking, oh no, they realize what they've done wrong, and then they have a chance to be forgiven of those things. And so I'm thankful that Jesus is patient, and we see that patience with his brothers here, and eventually they would turn out to be men who were some of his greatest supporters. There's a verse, I think it's in Peter, I'm going to butcher this, but it talks about how the Lord is long-suffering, not wanting anybody to perish, but that all people would come to repentance. And I think we see a picture of it here. The people in the city were very cautious not to let the Jewish leaders hear them discussing Jesus. Apparently, they had forbid the discussion about Jesus. And we find out in chapter 9 that they were banishing Jews who confessed Jesus and said that they believed in Jesus from the synagogue. They're kicking them out, basically. So being kicked out of the synagogue would have been a really significant punishment for anyone who was a Jew. That was a big part of Jewish life. And obviously they didn't want that to happen. And the Pharisees were not friendly with anybody discussing Jesus. I think that reveals a lot about the Pharisees. Generally, authorities only deem discussion about something illegal when they see it as a threat. If it's nonsense, they don't really care. but clearly they viewed Jesus as a threat, and tells us something about the sincerity of the Jewish leaders. They weren't interested in truth. They weren't interested in what Jesus had to say. They could not disprove what he had to say, and so really what they wanted to do was just hush the people up about it and suppress it. That strategy never really works in the long term. We've seen that in plenty of government systems, but it kind of gives you some insight into them. Verse 14 and 15. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? The feast was 7 days long. About the middle of the feast, Jesus finally makes a public appearance, and he begins teaching in the temple. Jesus' command of the Old Testament scriptures that he was teaching evidently was pretty astounding to the Jews, and they marveled. They couldn't figure out how somebody who had never been formally educated by a rabbi or some kind of rabbinic school or Torah school could have such a depth of understanding of the scriptures and what they meant and what they were pointing towards. Verse 16 through 18. So Jesus answered them, My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who is speaking on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. In him there is no falsehood. These words, this message from Jesus, speaks directly to the complaint of Jesus's brothers and to the suspicions of those who believe that Jesus was leading people astray. Jesus says right off the bat, I didn't come to earth to promote myself and my personal gain, personal glory. Jesus came from the Father to deliver the Father's message for the Father's glory. This answer also responds to those who were marveling at his, excuse me. It answers those who were marveling at his learning, those who are wondering how he could possibly know all these things since he never went to school. He's basically saying, I didn't acquire my knowledge of the law through your schools or your education system. I wasn't taught by religious scholars. If he had been, he probably would have been as messed up in his interpretation of the scriptures as some of the Jewish leaders. But obviously he wasn't. No, he had a profound understanding of the Old Testament law because he personally knew the creator of that law, and he had come to bring the creator's message down to mankind. And so, of course, he has mastery over the law. He says then that well, let me read the verse. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Anyone there with an honest heart who knew anything about the law would have been able to examine the scriptures and to understand Jesus's message and to see that it was in line with everything that the Old Testament talked about. There was no contradiction. Jesus wasn't tearing down the Old Testament law. He legitimately had come to fulfill that law, and anyone honest could have recognized that. Now, if you weren't honest, you could pretend like Jesus was a deceiver and trying to destroy the law. That's kind of the approach that the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes took. But anyone who was honest could recognize that actually wasn't the case. It's pretty easy generally to tell when somebody is a self-promoter. Jesus is saying in verse 18, he says, the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. When somebody's a self-promoter and they're out for their own glory, usually you can tell. Maybe they claim to be the origin of some new great idea, or invention, or maybe they have some wisdom that they came up with, and they want to be recognized for what they're bringing to the table. They want glory for themselves. But Jesus is saying that he didn't come to make a name for himself and to pursue earthly applause or attention or praise, but to make his Father known so that men would worship him. All right, verse 19. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? This was a very bold statement that Jesus makes. Remember, they were angry at Jesus because he had supposedly violated the law by healing that man on the Sabbath day. And also keep in mind, this was several months ago, if not more than that. They're still angry at him for this one occurrence. And so they're making this accusation, you've broken the law. And Jesus doesn't back down at all. He actually throws that back in their face. And he says, has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. You all are the lawbreakers. Who are you to accuse me when none of you keep the law correctly? That's basically what he's done. That's a bold thing to say when he's surrounded by these Jewish people in their hometown. Verse 20, the crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus' statements didn't do a whole lot to calm the tempers of the Jews, and they told Jesus that he had a demon, and then they tried to deny Jesus' statement about their intentions to kill him. And that's a pretty common way of acting for people who are on the defensive, if you've ever noticed that. Just watch the nightly news and you'll see this all over the place. Just watch politics, any political debate of any kind, you'll see this. The people who are being called out, what do? They act like the person who is accusing them is over-exaggerating, right? What do you mean we wanted to kill you? You don't have any proof, basically. And then they pretend like the person who called them out is the crazy one. And that's what they're doing here with Jesus, suggesting that it's complete nonsense that Jesus would suggest that they wanted to kill him, right? You see that all over the place. Defensive people act this way. When you don't have any kind of defense, just insult the other person. Verse 21 through 23. Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made this man's whole body well? Of course, Jesus did many miracles, but it was... Ooh, I just kicked my tripod. Jesus did many miracles, but the one that the Jews held on to was this healing on the Sabbath day. So Jesus compares what he had done on the Sabbath day to the way that the Jews kept the law of Moses regarding circumcision. Circumcision was a sign from God that for specifically the Jewish people. And it had been around for a long time. It had been around actually before the law of Moses was even given on Mount Sinai in Moses' time, but it had been incorporated into that law. You can read about it in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3. Male infants were supposed to be circumcised on the 8th day. But the question was, well, what if that 8th day was a Sabbath day? You weren't allowed to do any work. Are you supposed to? Which law are you supposed to break, right? And Jesus informs us that the practice of the Jews was to go ahead and circumcise that child anyway, even if it was a Sabbath day. Jesus doesn't express any problem with that practice. He doesn't condemn them for doing it, but he only asks them to be consistent about the way that they apply their judgments. Because here's another question. Was loving your neighbor as yourself, was that not also part of the Old Testament law? Was kindness not in the Old Testament scriptures? And the answer was, well, yes, of course they were. And so we have the same situation, the same kind of logical application of what the Jews were doing with circumcision with what Jesus had done on the Sabbath day. Loving your neighbor as yourself was also in the law, and Jesus had done that to this man that he had met who was lame and needed healing. Jesus' healing of the sick man wasn't a violation of the law any more than circumcision was a violation. I think this goes back to the principles that we saw, I believe it was in Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus is talking about, well, he proclaims himself Lord of the Sabbath, and that there's no problem with his disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. There's no violation there. He gives us two examples about priests offering sacrifices on the Sabbath and David eating the showbread. I think the same principles are present here. What Jesus is saying is be consistent. Circumcision on the Sabbath day is no more condemnable than healing a man on the Sabbath day. So be consistent with your judgments. You don't condemn the circumcisers, therefore you ought not to condemn me. He's calling out their hypocrisy, basically. And he goes on to say that he's made a whole man's body well. They were concerned about one body part on a male when performing circumcision. Jesus had healed an entire man's body. So their accusation was inconsistent with their own actions, especially considering that Jesus' healing of the lame man had required him significantly less work than it would have required the Jewish leaders to circumcise a child. So all kinds of inconsistencies. But then verse 24, this is a verse that you hear quite a bit quoted, but it's almost never quoted kind of in the context. And so it's good to approach it from the context to find out what it's actually saying. Verse 24, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. I have a typo in my notes. Let me fix that. This is the last verse that we're going to cover, and then we will cover the second half in the next video. But the Jews were looking at this situation from a very surface, a very shallow level, and they saw something that they didn't like, and they immediately condemned it, not realizing that they were practicing the same things themselves. Their judgments were tilted based on their prejudices. The Jewish leaders needed to take a hard look at their hearts, at the law and the spirit of that law, and correct their judgments accordingly. Not condemn people for things that they're doing themselves. That's what Jesus is saying here. And by way of application, I think that's definitely a huge lesson that we need to learn as well. We need to be careful that we aren't condemning something or somebody for something that we are participating in ourselves. Sometimes knowing that means that we got to get a little bit below the surface, not just to look at the outward actions, the appearances, but to look at the motivations behind those actions. It's easy, like the Jews, to judge someone's visible actions based on surface level evaluation while not realizing that we justify some of our own actions with the same logic. It's very common for people's prejudices to interfere with their ability to judge rightly and impartially. And I think there's very few things that will cause you to lose respect in the eyes of others faster than when your judgments are skewed in your own favor, especially in the church. And so we need to be careful that we aren't justifying our actions with the same logic we are using to condemn the actions of other people. That's, I think, what Jesus is getting at here. We see the inconsistency in the Pharisees. It's a warning for us, or not the Pharisees. I keep wanting to say that because Matthew and Mark are always talking about the Pharisees, Sadducees. John kind of keeps some of that language out here, at least in these first initial chapters. But the Jews were guilty of this. And Jesus has to correct it, and we need to watch out for it as well. So that's all I've got. It's what we got for the first half of John chapter 7. We'll finish off the second half in the next video. And until then, hope you guys have a great day. Remember to grab those notes in the ebook down below. Subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell notification if you haven't already. That way it'll notify you every time a new video comes out. And remember, these are also on podcast as well. If just listening to the audio is easier for you, you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Google Play, and some others. So check that out if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.